Welcome to our webinar on the seafood market in the UAE. My name is Mena McNiven and I am the food industry specialist at the Department for International Trade. We are partnering with Seafish today on this event, and I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our guest speakers who are joining us. We have a full agenda. We have some opening remarks from Laura Burdenova, the new DEFRA Agri-Food Councillor for the UAE. We have an overview of the seafood market in the UAE, a discussion on market access, as well as a presentation from Nielsen on COVID-19. There'll also be an opportunity at the end for you to ask any questions to any of our guest speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Lorna, who has recently joined the team in DEFRA, as I said, as the Agri-Food Councillor for the UAE.
Thank you, Mena, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you today for this webinar. As Mena has already introduced me, I'm Lorna Burdenova, and I'm the UK's first Agriculture, Food and Drink Councillor to the Gulf region, and the second such person in this role globally for the UK. I'd just like to take a few moments to introduce my role for those of you that I've yet to meet. So my role focuses on supporting the UK food and drink sector to export to the Gulf region. And that's both businesses who are already exporting and those who are looking to expand into the region. This is through a combination of government to government engagement in the region and working with colleagues across the region, such as my colleague Adil Khan, who you'll hear from shortly, and those back in the UK, such as Mena and her team, to support exports, particularly looking at market access issues and trade barriers. I'm also really keen to identify specific opportunities for growing UK food and drink exports to the region, such as the ones that we'll be discussing here today. The UAE and the wider Gulf region are really exciting markets with a lot of opportunities for UK food and drink producers, including in the seafood sector, as we'll be hearing. And I'm really looking forward to helping businesses explore these opportunities and, of course, to being able to eat British fish and seafood once I'm in Dubai. So on to the focus of today's event. Seafood is a key sector in the UAE, with seafood consumption per capita one of the highest in the world, estimated to be between 28 and 29 kilos per person per year. In comparison, here in the UK, we consume around 22 to 23 kilos per person per year. There's great potential for expanding UK exports to this market, as we'll hear in more detail from the other speakers, particularly into the hospitality sector, as well as by increasing the range of species and products which we export. In 2019, the UK exported over 1,200 tonnes of fish and seafood to the UAE, which was a 14% increase from 2017. And I know that there is room to grow this even more in the coming years. So I really hope you enjoyed today's event, and please feel free to reach out to me with any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lorna. I would like to introduce you to our next speaker, who's going to give an overview of the seafood market in the UAE, Varela Ogadimu. Thank you, Varela.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you on the UAE's seafood market. I'll just give you a quick background as about myself and what I do. I work for the British Centres for Business, and we are the delivery partner for the British Embassy. We've been working with British companies that are looking to expand into the UAE market and helping them to identify opportunities. And we work across various sectors, from food and beverage to healthcare, to construction, you name it. We have sector specialists, which you would see, specialists who would work with the different companies to achieve their goals. I specifically manage the food and beverage segment for the British Centres for Business. And I have a team, colleagues of about 12 people in the UAE that can provide support in one way or the other across several sectors. We provide a number of services to companies, from partner search to competitors analysis to site analysis for companies that want to set up in the UAE market, to one-to-one business matchmaking and including trade missions. We've organized a number of events for several organizations, UK bodies, including the Seafish as well. We've done a lot of things for AHDB. We've done a lot of work with Santander on their export programs. We've worked with Northern Ireland, the Welsh, you name it. We do a lot of work with UK bodies. So we are very familiar with working with UK companies. That being said, and I won't take too much of our time on briefs about the BCB. I'll just go straight into the topic for today. And I will first of all like to start with a general overview of the UAE market. So I'm sure that everyone here already knows that UAE is very dependent on food imports. And that is because of our arid land conditions, whereby we cannot really produce a lot of things. Although the UAE government have really invested and are trying to do all that they can to increase food production. For example, there's a lot of investment going into things like hydroponics and things and scientific means to increase the production and yield within the country. However, that on its own has not in any way been able to meet the demands of the country. So we still depend really on imports to meet our food demand. About 85% of our food is being imported, although the country is now focusing a whole lot more on encouraging manufacturing within the UAE market so that more food can be produced. But even the food from the used for the manufacturing, a lot of it is even brought in as well. So there really is, of course, a big reliance on food imports. Food security is number one thing within the UAE market. For the government, they are looking for every single way that they can to improve food security within the food space. F&B is a very important segment in the UAE because it's a big contributor for the GDP. A big chunk of this can be likened to the high tourism rate that we have in the UAE. So 13% of the GDP is linked to food activities. Also, the UAE is strategically located such that a lot of companies use the country as a transit point to ship to other countries in the world or to other destinations. So we have a lot of re-exporting happening within the UAE market. Of course, like you probably are aware, there's a big appreciation for UK brands within the UAE. You find many of the big brands that you are probably familiar with in the UK are currently present in the UAE currently. So moving on, just to focus a little bit more on the seafood. Seafood is a very big and important delicacy when it comes to the UAE diet. There's a lot of people eat fish. Let's just put it as simple as that. The government has been doing a lot and has been investing a whole lot in aquaculture and different investments in seafood farming locally. However, that is still not enough. Like I mentioned earlier, we still depend a whole lot on imports. So 70% of our seafood in the UAE is imported, and the UAE is the highest consumer in the UAE. Like Lorna said earlier, like about 28 kilogram is consumed per year per person when it comes to seafood in the UAE. In 2019, about 4%. There was a 4% growth in seafood in the UAE, and there's a whole lot, and about 4.7% is projected in the next 5 years. So there's a whole lot of scope, a whole lot of potential for the UAE seafood market. Moving on there, you will not talk about the UK seafood import into the UAE. There's a growing demand as we can see that over the years, we've seen that the import or the volume of import of seafood from the UK is increasing. In 2017, there are about 1,100 tons imported. That's in 2017, and by 2019, we've increased it by 14% to about 120,000 tons. That shows you a progressive increase in the demand and appreciation for British products. Salmon, of course, is one of the most imported products from the UK into this market, along with other products, but we see a whole lot of salmon coming into the UAE market. Talking about the best way to enter into the market, the most common option is usually finding a wholesaler or distributor. And I've put in here some very common wholesalers or distributors that probably are familiar with, either the Deep Seafood Company or Fresh Plus. But there are other distributors within the market. But the most, I would say, to me, the most important part of bringing product into the UAE will probably be selling into hypermarket and supermarket, because that is where most of the whole activities happen. A lot of you residents are very confident, or they are very comfortable shopping for seafood from hypermarket and supermarkets. And the reason for this is they are assured of the quality of the seafood that they will find there. Most wholesalers and distributors, some would supply into the retail, but a good portion of it goes into food service. So when you look at targeting mainly the consumers, which is individuals, you find that supermarket and hypermarkets are the main place. Although during COVID, we find that a lot of wholesalers started selling directly to consumers. They optimized their website and started selling in smaller quantities to consumers, because a big chunk of their supply was gone because hotels and food service was shut down during that lockdown. So they all had to find a way to adapt to the current situation. And we do think that that might still be something that they will continue going forward, even post-COVID, as they try to sell more into the market. So hypermarket, supermarket are still the most common when it comes to buying of seafood. And some of these companies have the capacity to buy directly from suppliers from the UK. Carrefour, for example, has a buying office and they in the UK, and they can easily buy product directly from a supplier and bring it to the market. Another segment that is worth mentioning is independent grocers. So you find that the Dubai government developed what they call the seafood market somewhere in Dera, where you find individuals or smaller companies that sell seafood having a small kiosk where they display their food and consumers can go in and buy food. The demand in that segment is also increasing, because you find that initially people were a bit skeptical about the quality, but there's been a lot of clampdown on ensuring of the quality and the hygiene of the area. So people are becoming more and more comfortable, although it's a lot harder to track down who is the decision maker in this small grocers, or to find out who will be the right person. So this hypermarket is probably a more simpler and a more direct way. And also when you compare the price point, of course, supermarkets are way more they're way more expensive than the smaller grocers. Another important way that I think is another important method I think will be very useful for exporters that are trying to get into this market is the food processing. We are beginning to see a whole lot of value-added seafood packaged and sold in supermarkets to consumers. Many of the local companies we now have breaded fish, we have a lot of breaded shrimp and other value-added products like that, such that consumers can easily take basically things that they can easily do in their house without having to go through a long process. And the big driver for this is UAE residents, they barely have time to say they want to cook up something or homemade meal. So there's a whole drive to easy food that they can easily turn around within a quick time. So this is driving the food processing demand, and there is opportunity to supply into these companies or if you can develop a collaboration or a partnership with any one of them. That being said, I'm just going to go through some of the things that are driving the UAE seafood market. First of all is the population growth. UAE tends to attract a lot of young people that are coming here to work. So you find that the numbers of people and the high disposable income is increasing the number of people into the country. Then you also talk about tourism. If we remove this whole COVID situation, which has kind of dampened the global economy, you'll find that a lot of people come here for holidays, either and spending an average of 1 week in the UAE. So, and trying out different things. So tourism is another thing that is driving the demand for seafood. There's also a big push for health and wellness. A lot of people are trying to be more actually they are more health conscious. So consequently, that is driving the demand for organic seafood and organic fish and things in that space. Another important factor that is worth mentioning is Expo 2020, which has now been moved to October 2021. That is also going to push the demand for seafood in this market, because for the Expo, the UAE is expecting a footfall of about 25 million people within that period. So this will definitely increase the demand for seafood. Of course, I mentioned this earlier, there's high disposable income in this part of the world. There are no income tax, so people have extra money to be able to spend on something that they really like or enjoy. In terms of trends, as I mentioned earlier, consumers are looking for convenience. So anything that is quick, fast, that they can just turn around within a short time is very, very important. So having value-added seafood is very, very important. There's an increasing demand for frozen food, frozen fish. You find that initially there were a lot of resistance to frozen seafish, but people are becoming more confident that the fish is quality and that they can get the fish. The fish is not one that has stayed on for too long, so they are more confident in buying the frozen fish. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a big demand for organic fish and seafood. All of that is equally growing within the market, as well as crustaceans. That summarizes some of the things that is happening within the UAE seafood market. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop in the chat box or feel free to reach out to me directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wura, for a really interesting presentation. I'm going to move swiftly on to our next today. My colleague Adil Khan from the Department for International Trade team in the UAE. Adil is going to talk and present market access to the UAE. Thanks, Adil.
Thank you very much, Mena, for the introduction, and thank you, Wura, for providing an overview about the seafood sector in the UAE. I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep my camera off because there could be issues of the call dropping. So I'm just going to concentrate more on what DIT does and how it can support and help British companies. Although a lot of you all might already be aware of that and must be working with your DIT colleagues in your specific region, I just thought I'd give you all an overview about the DIT office and our structure in the UAE. Can I have the next slide, please? So that's an overview about DIT Middle East, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. That's the region we are based in, which comprises 12 countries and is headed by Simon Penny, who's our trade commissioner. He's based in Dubai. We've got DIT, or the world, is broken up into 9 regions, and we are one of them. And As you can see, taken as a region, the GCC is the UK's second largest export market outside Europe. And within the GCC, the UAE makes up 40% of our trade in the region. And so basically, DIT promotes British products and services across the world and ensures firms take advantage of opportunities open to them in various markets. Of course, the UAE is the most developed country in the Arab Gulf, and its economy is only the second largest in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia. Value to UK exports to the UAE was 12.1 billion in 2019, an increase of approximately 14% over 2018. We have approximately 100 plus DIT personnel in the MEAP region to help and support UK companies that want to export to this region, and also work with local organizations that want to invest in the UK. Approximately 120,000 British expats call UAE their home and we receive about 1 million visitors from the UK every year. Of course, I mean, the pandemic is a blip, but generally speaking, that's how it is in terms of the numbers. And the Emiratis fondly call London its 8th emirate, and many pursue higher education and own homes and properties in the UK. So there's a natural affinity towards the UK from the Emiratis. Next slide, please. I just want to quickly talk about the food and drink sector in the UAE, although Bura did touch upon it. So as you can see, those are kind of broad figures in terms of how much percentage of food is imported by the UAE, which is rather large. Bura did mention the size of our exports in food and drink, and that's about 361 million in 2018. Expo is going to be really big, and we're doing everything that we possibly can to make sure that the UK benefits from all the opportunities that are coming out of Expo. Very large brands such as Tesco, M&S, Waitrose are already well established here. Sainsbury's started selling its products from October, which is about a month ago. We've got, the UK is considered to be leading on new food trends like organic, vegan, free from, and healthy alternatives, all which are showing massive growth, not only in the UAE, but across the region and beyond, as people are becoming much more health conscious and are more interested in the farm to fork journey. So the UK certainly is a known brand as far as food is concerned. In fact, in 2017, this is a really interesting one. In 2017, the UK ranked 33rd in terms of quantity of food items imported into Dubai, which was approximately 55,000 tons. But it took the top spot for number of items imported. That was approximately 292,000. So this shows the wide and diverse range and offer from the UK and the trust people place on brand Britain. Again, as mentioned, Expo 2020 is expected to drive demand for food products, and we're working with all our stakeholders to ensure that UK suppliers benefit from this increased demand. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just spend a little time on market access, which I was asked to speak about. So as you can imagine, the food and drink sector is certainly one of the key sectors where we come across a number of market access issues in the UAE and the region, so to speak. Things like Arabic labeling. We are now struggling with something called, there's a new nutritional labeling requirement. There are additive issues, what goes into food products in terms of additives. There are other issues coming up on the horizon, like traffic lights on food packaging, which is currently voluntary but might become mandatory. So there are a lot of market access barriers that we're constantly coming up against and dealing with to ensure that supply of UK products into the market sort of move really smoothly. I just want to quickly talk about these 3 or 4 issues that we recently came across. So during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, we successfully lobbied with the UAE authorities to exempt UK food products from the mandatory Arabic labeling and production date coding, which absolutely helped our exporters tremendously, simply because they didn't have enough people, labor force to actually stick Arabic labels on the food items. The UAE was really helpful in understanding the issue, and they provided not just us, but generally speaking, everybody else, the exemption. Of course, we reached out to them first, so that certainly helped everybody else. So that certainly was of great assistance to our exporters. We also successfully lobbied for the UAE to accept scanned copies of export health certificates via email during the ongoing pandemic. What normally used to happen is export health certificates used to travel as hard copies with shipments. That is no longer required, and that's because of the pandemic. We are hoping and we're working with the UAE authorities to ensure that this process is accepted as the norm even after the pandemic, so that we don't have to go back to the hard copy paperwork accompanying each shipment. Specifically on seafood, we've had some issues. The one that I have been dealing with in the last year and a half has been with the epizootic ulcerative syndrome disease, which normally exists in fish or seafood in tropical waters. But the UAE was very specific that all our health certificates should have that declaration in the EHC saying that all the fish or seafood coming from the UK is free of epizootic ulcerative syndrome. We've had issues where shipments from a number of exporters were held up at the import point into the UAE, and we had to then deal with with the authorities to try and clear them. And thankfully, nothing. I mean, the exporters didn't suffer. We managed to clear the shipments. But in order to ensure that this didn't happen all the time, we worked with DEFRA and with the Food Standards Agency and the Food Standards Scotland Agency to ensure that now all our health certificates leaving the UK from about September onwards have this declaration saying that the shipment of seafood is free of epizootic ulcerative syndrome. So that actually has gone into all our health certificates. That's been really great working with DEFRA, FSA, and FSS. Similarly, on the wild fish and farmed fish bit that we resolved, again, these were issues where some local authorities mentioned that in the EHCs while the others didn't. Again, we're working with DEFRA and with FSA and FSS. We managed to ensure that all our health certificates now carry a declaration. If it is wild fish, it's clearly mentioned it is wild fish. And if it is farmed fish, then on the declarations, it needs to have a pork-free fed declaration. Of course, the onus on supplying this information is with the exporter to the certifying local authority, if that is not the local authority with the enforcement responsibility at the production side. So we managed that to ensure that across the UK, whether it is England, Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, all the local authorities are aware of this requirement. If any of the exporters face any issue with this, please come back to us and we'll make sure that the local authorities are aware of it. And of course, we are, as I said, this is a regular thing. We're dealing with lots of market access issues, and we are regularly in touch with authorities to try and ensure that we break down these barriers in order to ensure smooth flow of goods and services between both the countries. Next slide, please. I just want to quickly talk about the DIT assistance to UK companies. I mean, I've just mentioned a few events that we recently did post-pandemics. As you can see, we organized a virtual Meet the Buyer event for our dairy suppliers. That went very well. We had 40 one-to-one face-to-face meetings between suppliers in the UK and buyers in the UAE. We had an AgriTech webinar in September to talk about opportunities in that sector, and 6 markets in the MEAP region presented at that webinar. Today, we're doing the seafood webinar. We're working on a Gulf food Meet the Buyer virtual event. In 2019 and earlier this year, we had face-to-face meetings at Gulf Food. And at both the events, we had 350 plus meetings on a single morning. Because we're unsure of how Gulf Food 2020 might turn up, whether the event might go ahead, people might not turn up, we've decided to move our meetings online. And we are looking to run this in late January. We're working with our colleagues, DIT colleagues in all the English regions and in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to ensure we have the right set of suppliers to join the one-to-one meetings. With the 40 plus buyers, we'll be recruiting for the 2-day event across from across MEAP and India. Of course, this information will be conveyed to our colleagues, who in turn will convey it to everybody else who's interested in being part of that. We're doing other things like, we work with, we ensure that if you come to this market and you want to also go into other parts of the MEAP region, then we'll make sure that you are connected to our colleagues in the other GCC markets. We are looking at new customers to introduce UK companies to. For example, we did some work recently with Emirates, with Etihad Airways, with the Abu Dhabi government, who are looking to procure food and drink items for sort of the COVID sort of period. Again, there are specialist retailers and organic, free from healthy food categories that we keep in touch with to ensure that we introduce customers to them or companies to them. There are online platforms. We're working very closely with Amazon, with Noon, with Truebell, with Mum's World, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of stuff that we're looking to do, and we're here to help and assist companies in the market. So please feel free to get in touch with us. And what we're also looking to do is, going forward after this webinar, is to work with Seafish and see if exporters are interested in doing a virtual Meet the Buyer event specifically on the seafood front. We'll be happy to organize that in early 2021. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adil, for the presentation. 2 points I'd just like to mention. Firstly, if you are interested in speaking to Adil or any sort of future events on seafood, the first port of call would be your international trade advisor, and Lynn will be providing details of how you get in touch with them at the end of this session. Secondly, just to say, we have also invested in an overseas market report on the UAE, specifically on the seafood market. And this has been recently updated and will be available on the Seafish website. And Lynn, again, will provide details of that for you at the end of this session. But DIT have invested in this. It's up to date as of yesterday, so we should give you all the latest data that you need on the market. I'd like now just to move on to our next session and say a big thank you to Pavlos from Nielsen, who is going to present a session on COVID-19. Thanks, Pavlos.
Hello, everybody. I'm really excited that I am here with you today to share some information, some insights that we have as Nielsen we did back in May 2020. This is an extract. I'm trying to share my screen. Yeah, okay, perfect. So this is an extract from a bigger deck with, upon request, it can be made available to you. And we would be very happy to share it with anyone that needs to see a little bit more depth of what we have collected back then. So I will start with the date, 1492. Many of you, maybe you can recognize the date, but back then, like today, the trade had a challenge. They wanted to trade faster and safer with East Indies. And traders, of course, they were very willing to overcome this challenge, exploring different routes in order to achieve this objective. They based their calculations on the principle that Earth is round. It's not something new today, but back then maybe it was new information. And they wanted to invest in this in order to achieve their target. However, they were missing fundamental information, basic information, for example, maps. So they were not prepared for the outcome, which came to them as a surprise. So although the discovery of America was a great opportunity, they could have reached there without the element of surprise if, as I mentioned before, the necessary information were available, the maps. So as Nielsen, in our effort to help you prepare for the future under the new paradigm that is in place and discover new opportunities, limiting the element of surprise, which can be very costly, as everybody knows in business, we are predicting 4 emerging These emerging patterns, or these 4 emerging patterns that we are going to touch on not in great detail, but I think the message is going to be there, is the basket reset, which is what consumers will buy, the home body reset, where consumption is going to happen, the rationale reset, why consumers will make purchases, and affordability reset, how much consumers will spend. Before going into this, let's see a few key happenings that COVID-19 brought. If we examine, breaking down those that were impacted, if we look across the globe, across the different regions, the #1 impact is on the job losses, followed by health. But the new economic constraints, they have a heavier impact on what COVID brought with them, and especially the 2 regions of LATAM and Africa, Middle East. What else happened? We will see here that the constrained consumers, and when we say constrained consumers, we mean consumers that they were impacted during this period. It was 16%. During Q2 2020 alone, unemployment spiked to 16% in a single quarter. Unfortunately, we do not foresee that this is going to rebound in a year or 2. It will take longer. And of course, our study was conducted back in May. Maybe this figure, it can be potentially higher, maybe beyond 20%. Of course, I don't have the data to back this up, but we all see the consequences. So we expect that also this, the effect of this, it will take many years in order to rebound back. If we examine what has happened during the global financial crisis that we faced back in 2008 and 2009, the unemployment increase in a duration of 2 years, and it took 10 good years in order to get back to normal. With the COVID-19, because the unemployment impact had been more sudden and severe across multiple industries, we expect that the recovery period is going to be more than 10 years, unfortunately. Another important happening is the Consumer Confidence Index. In a single quarter, the confidence index dropped by 14 points. If we compare similar happening during the global financial crisis, the Consumer Confidence Index dropped by 20 points. However, it has taken 5 quarters in order to reach to this point. So this is another indicator that we should be expecting the recovery to be slower of what we have experienced back in 2008, 2009. All right, let's explore a little bit more about the 4 different behavior resets that we are expecting to have. First of all, what we are observing, or what we have collected during our study, is that the FMCG basket size slows down or stabilizes. Indeed, during the COVID, during the lockdown period, we have seen a spike in consumption. However, now what we see a stabilizing, we see slowing down. Depending on the category, from what I know from UAE, in certain instances, and since we are talking about fish, the seafood industry, even though has declined just like the other categories, however, it has maintained a higher value compared to the 2 previous years. Another important happening, which my opinion, my personal opinion is that the online basket, the e-commerce, has grown drastically, dramatically, in a very short period of time. We were expecting the e-commerce to grow, but I think the COVID situation has given the right for the e-commerce to grow so fast in such a short period of time. And I would say that we do not expect to see things going backwards. I am of the opinion that this is going to continue in the future. So the business behaviors adapts to the new basket needs. As I mentioned, the e-commerce, the COVID-19 has given a big, has given the excuse to the e-commerce to accelerate. What we know that currently is happening, because consumers have changed, as we are going to see later on, how they are shopping. The convenience stores, they are looking into their assortment. And just a short side comment from another study that we have completed recently, yet is not out in the market, is that shop shifting, where we see that population is moving because of the lockdown, working from home. This is impacting how different shops are performing. Where before they were important, now they are becoming less important. People, they are rethinking about what they are buying, the different types of products that they are buying. And of course, another way that businesses are adapting to the new basket needs is that they bringing the old and new needs from the consumer under one product. Predicting the home body reset, where consumption is going to happen. First of all, it's worth to mention that the consumers maintain or grow the monthly budget for essentials at home. And the figures are there. I will not read them out because you are going to receive the deck. The key message here is that it's either growing or remains the same. So this is something that as manufacturers, we should be happy about. Now, what we need though to know is that the DIY categories, they are on the growth. What we mean DIY categories is categories in the likes of bake it yourself, maintain it yourself, treat it, mix it, create it, prepare it. And here I have a number of categories that we've seen tremendous growth. For instance, baking mixes, a growth of 23%, hair costume coloring, 35%, seaweed and sushi wrap, 53%. This is telling us that opportunities, even though we are facing a big challenge, it seems that different doors are closing. However, other doors are opening up. What is the secret to success? Is to just identify these opportunities and work on them and capitalize on them. There are big shifts in-home eating. Of course, if we are locked down, and this was happening during the first lockdown, now we are moving towards the second lockdown, which I hope it will not be as severe as in the first wave. Because people were staying home, that's why we have seen the DIY, but also we are seeing the food delivery or the food to go growing dramatically. I have observed this in UAE, and my personal experience is that during the lockdown, of course, we had some flexibility in moving, going to the supermarket, groceries, pharmacies, and up to that point, I would say that the delivery the delivery bikes were more in the street than ever before. And we see an example here from Australia. We see 58%. What is the reason for purchasing food delivery? Is 58% convenience at home delivery. Reason for purchasing meal kit is again convenience. So the game is changing, and the name is convenience. we need to address this. We need to make things more convenient and seamless for our consumers. Preparing for the permanent shift, because as I said before, this change is not a change that is going to go away. Rather, it's a change that is going to stay. Now, depending how things are going to develop from now on, whether this is going to be accelerated even further or reduce the momentum. However, the way is only forward. There is no backwards. So there are here that companies must innovate to include home-based services. And we have seen Uber Eats joining forces with Carrefour. I'm giving some examples here. There are new focus areas for convenience stores, looking at the new preference, consumer preference, the new products that consumers will prefer to enjoy, and of course, innovation. Innovation can change things for the better. And here I am showing an example from Malaysia, but there are many, many other examples that somebody can put. Why consumers will make purchases? Consumers are rebalancing their wallet priorities. And this is, we are showing here on this slide, the percentage of the respondents who have changed spending to save on expenses. Across the different regions, we have seen that because of uncertainty, because of we don't know what is coming next, we don't have a clear direction, we prefer to save and rather than continue to expand or spend the way that we did before. There is 10 percentage points difference from Q4 19 to Q2 2020. And perhaps this number can grow even further. This is a very interesting slide. What basically is telling us here, I would take the example of the cruise ship travel. And what we have examined through the study is that people that in the last 3 years, they have gone in a cruise ship travel because they cannot do it now. And this, of course, they are consumers that were immune from the current situation. They can spend, the percentage of the probability of spending on wine is 40% higher compared to before. On spirits is 25%, and on pet toys is 10%. We will see later on that people, because they cannot spend, and especially the immune consumer, because they cannot spend on what they used to spend in travel, in luxury products, etc., they will try to indulge themselves through different consumer products, what we call them like more luxurious products. So the opportunities that emerge as consumers redefine why they buy, embracing the new take on old traditions, is something that somebody can do. The millennials' mindset is shifting from spending to saving, and there are the new ways of either entertaining ourselves or making holidays. The new word is staycations, which I have practiced myself, I have to say. Since we cannot travel, then we find other ways in order to entertain and to relax. And finally, the final section, the final prediction is how much consumer will spend. This is a very interesting section. Consumers have felt a noticeable decline in promotions, particularly in brick and mortar stores. And this, according to our study, this is 32%. It is a reality, and I have witnessed it myself in UAE, that comparing the the promotion, the depth of the promotions and the number of promotions that we used to have before COVID, during COVID, and after lockdown, there is a substantial change. And the consumers have noticed that. This is another factual information on the topic that I was discussing on the promotions, where in November 2017, in US, 32 of the products were sold on promotion. In March 2020, this became 28%, and in May 2020, this is 19%. Of course, there is a slight rebound, but I think it's a little bit premature to see the depth and the duration of the promotion of what we have seen in the past. Now, how this has impacted the overall retail environment. The discount retail outlets, they gain additional traction with the shoppers in recent weeks. That was week 27, week 28. We can examine for the different countries, simply because they were discounts. So the consumers, they will think twice and thrice how they will spend their dollar, their pound, or whatever other currency they will be using. So neglecting the affordability reset could put your products out of reach for many consumers. Cutting prices on essential goods, the rise of everyday low prices, and of course, accessible pricing of luxury goods for those consumers that they can and they are willing to spend more on luxury products. And I will leave you with this slide, with thinking ahead on what consumers will buy, where, why, and how much. I will not read out the different headings. It will be at your disposal to go through it. And if you have any questions, I would be more than willing to address. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pavlos. A really, really interesting presentation on the impact of COVID-19, not just the UAE, but for all markets. So yeah, big thank you for joining us today. So as I said, we partnered on this event today with Seafish. It's a second in a series of webinars that we're running. We'll be running another one next month, and we hope to do more in the new year again. We wanted to highlight two things. Firstly, where you can access support. So the first place to start through the Department for International Trade is through your International Trade Advisor. You can go onto the great.gov website, contact Office Finder, and that will put you in touch with your local office. There is a wealth of support in the regions and with our international trade advisors. They can advise you on anything from where to start on exporting, the services that are available from the Department for International Trade, as well as putting you in touch with events and colleagues who are overseas. Secondly, Seafish, Lynn has kindly shared the Seafish contacts, so Lynn's Lynn's email address and Philip, project coordinator. There is also a huge amount of information available on the Seafish website, certainly information on trade and regulations. As I mentioned earlier on, DIT have invested in a seafood market report on the UAE, which can be found on the Seafish website. I think it will be going on there in the next week or so. So we'll be happy to send you an email when that goes out, and please have a look on that. I believe this is the link for it here: Seafish Trade and Regulations, International Trade. And Seafish invested themselves in a huge number of these reports. They're very, very useful and have useful contacts in them. How to access markets, pricing, route to market. So lots of information. It's a really good place to start on those. One other final really useful piece of information is that Seafish have lots of market data available as well. and that also can be found on their website.